Okay, when it comes to an audio file, there are two numbers that you always see attached to an audio file. That is the sampling rate and the bit rate. Now, there are kind of standards for what those numbers are, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. First, let's talk about what those numbers mean, okay? And let's start with sampling rate. So the sampling rate is a number that tells us how many samples there are per second, okay? So if we remember back to when we were first talking about what digital audio is, we said that there are a whole bunch of little snapshots of the sound that we then break up into these little slices, okay? And each one of those is called a sample. Okay, now this is a little bit different. There's a weird terminology thing here. We can talk about samples in terms of like a kick sample or a snare sample or things like that. This is different than that. When we're talking about the sampling rate, what we're talking about is those little snapshots of sound and how many times per second that happens. It's a little different than the sample that we talk about when we're talking about using a sample to make music. These samples look like this. Okay, I'm going to zoom in on our audio file. Zoom in, keep zooming in, keep zooming in. There they are. Okay, each one of these is a sample. Okay, each one of these little dots. Okay, so our sampling rate tells us how many of those there are per second. Now, it's not unlike video, right? When you watch video, you might be looking at something that's 32 frames per second, okay? What that means is that there are 32 still images, just pictures, flashing in front of your eyes, and if we do it 32 of those per second, you perceive it as normal motion. This video you're watching now is probably exactly that. It's probably about 32 frames per second. It's 32 images per second, and we just flash those still images in front of your eyes, and your brain fills in the gaps and makes it look like fluid motion, okay? But it's really just a long series of still images flashing really fast. Now in video, it takes 32 of those per second for you to perceive it as motion. In audio, it takes quite a bit more samples per second in order for us to get up to a full quality audio file. Specifically, it takes about 44,100 of those per second. That's how many of these we have. Okay, 44,100 per second. That's a ton, right? That's a lot. So you can see that my sampling rate is 44,100. Now we sometimes abbreviate this 44.1K. Okay, 44.1K is a shorthand to say 44,100. So that is a standard sampling rate. Now it's not the only sampling rate. We can go higher than that and we can go lower than that. If I look here, it's going to give me the option to change it to a whole bunch of different sampling rates. I can go up to 48,000, 88,200. I can go all the way up to 384,000 samples per second. I could do that if I wanted to. So why would someone want to? If 44,100 is kind of the standard, and that term standard changes a little bit depending on what you're doing, but more or less, let's call that the standard. Why would I want to go higher or lower? If lower is going to degrade the sound and make it sound less good, and that's more or less true, wouldn't I want to go all the way to the top and always make it as high as possible to make the best sounding music? Not necessarily, because adding a higher sampling rate doesn't necessarily make a recording sound better. It actually means you can represent more frequencies. This is a weird kind of mathematical thing that happens in digital audio, and it's something that's really often misunderstood about sampling rates. So I often see people recording at 88,200 samples per second. And that's fine, you can do that, but what they think they're doing is recording higher definition when they're not really. What they're doing is recording higher frequencies. So let me go into a little bit of the math on this in the next video, and we'll talk about something called the Nyquist theorem.